The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet suburban street. The air was still, the hum of passing cars blending into the background as people went about their usual routines. It seemed like just another ordinary day, until the flashing red and blue lights shattered the calm. A sleek black sedan had pulled over to the side of the road, and within seconds, a police cruiser screeched to a halt right behind it. Officer Daniels stepped out first, adjusting his belt as he scanned the vehicle. His partner, Officer Reed, followed closely, his hand resting near his holster. They had been patrolling the area when they spotted the black car cruising through the neighborhood. It didn't take long for them to decide something was off. A lone black man in a high-end car in this part of town. That was enough to raise their suspicions. Without hesitation, they had flipped on their sirens and ordered him to pull over. Inside the car, Elijah Carter sat calmly, his hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the officers approach through his rearview mirror. He had seen this situation play out before, too many times in fact. He knew exactly what was coming. As Officer Daniels reached the driver's side window, his expression was already hardened with suspicion. "License and registration," Daniels demanded, his voice sharp. Elijah didn't argue. He moved slowly, methodically, keeping his motions deliberate. He had been trained to handle situations like this. But even as he handed over his documents, he could see the officers exchange a glance. It wasn't enough for them. They wanted more. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Reed asked, his tone laced with accusation. Elijah sighed inwardly. He knew this gang well. They didn't expect an answer. They expected an excuse. "Just passing through," he said simply. Daniels eyed him for a long moment, then gestured for him to step out of the vehicle. "Step out of the car," he ordered. "Hands where we can see them." Elijah hesitated. He knew his rights. There was no reason for him to step out. He hadn't broken any laws. But he also knew that resisting, even politely, would only escalate the situation. So with a quiet breath, he unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed open the door. As soon as he was out, Daniels wasted no time. He grabbed Elijah's wrist, twisting it behind his back. The sharp edge of cold metal cuffs snapped against his skin. "Really?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but firm. "What's the charge?" "We'll figure that out soon enough," Reed muttered. Daniels began patting him down aggressively, as if expecting to find something, anything, to justify what they were doing. Elijah could hear the clicks of their radios as they called in his information. A few curious neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, watching the scene unfold. Minutes passed. The radio static crackled in the air. Then suddenly, Reed's posture stiffened. He had just received the response from dispatch. His face paled as his eyes darted to the badge in Elijah's wallet. Daniels frowned at his partner's reaction. "What is it?" he asked impatiently. Reed hesitated before speaking. You might want to take a look at this." Daniels yanked the wallet from Reed's hand and flipped it open. The words stared back at him in bold, unmistakable letters. Asterisk asterisk Federal Bureau of Investigation asterisk asterisk. Elijah Carter wasn't just another driver on the road. He wasn't some random guy they could harass and walk away from. He was an FBI agent. For a moment, silence hung thick in the air. Daniel's grip on Elijah's arm loosened, the weight of his mistake dawning on him. Elijah turned his head slightly, his gaze locking onto Daniels. "Now," he said, his voice even, "are you going to uncuff me? Or should I make a call?" Reed swallowed hard. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. This was a disaster waiting to unfold. They had just arrested a federal agent. Daniels hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. He had treated Elijah like a suspect, humiliated him, and now the tables had turned. But what happened next? That was the real question. Would they try to cover it up? Would they let him go and hope he wouldn't report them? Or was this about to get even worse? One thing was certain, this was far from over. Daniel's hands hovered over the cuffs, his fingers twitching as he weighed his next move. The realization of who Elijah was had sent a shockwave through him, but pride and ego kept him from reacting too quickly. Reed was shifting uncomfortably beside him, his grip tightening on the radio at his waist, waiting for direction. The quiet suburban street, which had moments ago seemed like their domain, now felt suffocating. They had made a mistake, one that could cost them everything. Elijah stood motionless, his expression unreadable. He had been through situations like this before, too many times, but this one was different. He had seen officers make mistakes, but rarely had he been the one standing in handcuffs while holding all the power. He could feel the hesitation in Daniel's grip, the uncertainty in the air. Yet neither officer moved to correct their mistake. Reed cleared his throat, finally breaking the silence. Maybe we should. Daniels cut him off with a sharp look, his jaw tightening. We're handling this. His voice lacked the confidence it had moments earlier, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. Elijah let out a slow breath, keeping his composure. You ran my ID, he said evenly. You know who I am. And you also know I don't need your permission to make a call. He nodded toward his wrist. So are we going to do this the right way, or are we going to pretend you have a reason to keep me in cuffs? Daniels exhaled harshly, then finally, with obvious reluctance, pulled the key from his belt and unlocked the cuffs. They clattered slightly as they slid free from Elijah's wrists. He rubbed his wrists but didn't step back. He wasn't going to let them off that easy. Reed was the first to speak again. Look, this was just a routine stop. You fit the description of someone we were looking for. His words came out stiff, forced, as if he was reciting a script. Elijah let out a humorless chuckle. Oh, I fit the description. Let me guess. Black man, nice car, driving in the wrong neighborhood. His eyes locked onto Reed's, watching as the officer shifted uncomfortably. You pulled me over for nothing. Then you put me in cuffs for even less. And now you're trying to play it off like it was just a mix-up. Daniels crossed his arms. We had a reason to stop you. Elijah tilted his head slightly, unimpressed. Right. And what was that reason exactly? Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came out. He knew he had nothing to stand on. The tension thickened between them, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy in the air. A few bystanders had gathered a distance away, watching but not interfering. The presence of onlookers only made the situation more volatile. The last thing these officers wanted was to be caught on camera making things worse. Elijah finally took a step back, shaking his head. You know, I could walk away right now and let internal affairs handle this, he said. Or I could make one phone call and have your entire precinct asking questions you don't want to answer. He let his words settle. The threat wasn't empty, and both officers knew it. Reed took a small step forward, his voice lower this time. Listen, man, we didn't know. If we had, things would have been different. Elijah's gaze darkened. And that's exactly the problem, he said. If I weren't an FBI agent, how far would you have taken this? Neither officer answered. They didn't have to. The silence spoke volumes. Elijah let out another slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. This wasn't new to him. He had spent years in law enforcement, had seen the way power was abused, had even fought against it from within. But being on the receiving end, even now, with a badge of his own, was a bitter reminder of just how deep the issue ran. Daniel's radio crackled, breaking the tense moment. A voice on the other end asked for an update on their stop. He hesitated before responding. Uh, Everything's clear here, he said quickly. We're wrapping up. Elijah smirked slightly. That's one way to put it. Daniel shot him a glare, but said nothing. He was already regretting how he had handled the situation. He knew this wasn't over. Even if Elijah didn't press charges, word would get out. It always did. Reed, still looking uneasy, took another step forward. Look, we didn't mean for this to escalate. Elijah studied him for a moment. He wasn't sure if Reed actually regretted what had happened, or if he was just trying to cover himself. Either way, it didn't change the fact that this wasn't about just one bad stop. It was about a system that allowed things like this to happen over and over again. He finally exhaled, shaking his head. I'll be seeing you, he said simply before turning back to his car. He opened the door, sliding into the driver's seat, but he didn't pull away just yet. He sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, forcing himself to breathe. He knew he had options. He could file a complaint. He could push for an investigation. He could make sure these officers never forgot this day. But what frustrated him the most was knowing that for every time something like this happened to someone like him, there were countless other times it happened to someone who didn't have the badge, the rank, or the connections to fight back. Daniels and Reed stood frozen as Elijah finally started his engine. The roar of the car filled the silence between them, and as he pulled away, they exchanged a glance. They both knew the weight of what had just happened, but neither dared to say it out loud. As Elijah drove off, his mind wasn't just on what had happened. It was on what came next. He had let them walk away today, but that didn't mean he was letting it go. The real question now was, how far was he willing to take it? Elijah drove in silence, the hum of the engine barely registering in his mind. His hands gripped the wheel a little too tightly, and despite the cool air conditioning in the car, his body was still tense from what had just happened. He had dealt with situations like this before, but something about today stuck with him differently. Maybe it was the way Daniels had refused to admit fault, even after knowing who he was. Maybe it was the fact that Reed had looked like he wanted to back down, but didn't. Or maybe it was just the simple truth that, despite everything Elijah had achieved, moments like this still happened, over and over again. He pulled into his driveway and sat there for a while, staring at the dashboard. His phone vibrated in the cup holder, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced down and saw the name on the screen. Asterisk asterisk, Special Agent Carter asterisk asterisk. Elijah sighed before picking up. Yeah. You're back in town for less than a day, and I already have a mess to clean up, Carter said, his voice calm but laced with frustration. Word travels fast. It does when a local precinct runs a background check on an FBI agent they just detained. What happened? Elijah hesitated. He could downplay it, let it go, act like it was just another bad stop that wasn't worth pursuing. But something in his gut told him this wasn't over. They had no reason to stop me, and when I questioned them, they escalated. Cuffed me before they even checked my ID. Carter sighed on the other end. You know we can file a formal complaint. Yeah, I know. You don't sound convinced. Elijah rubbed his temple, thinking, if I push too hard, it'll be brushed off as me throwing my weight around. If I let it slide, nothing changes. There was a pause. Then Carter said, we could take another approach. Elijah frowned. What do you mean? Daniels has a history. Not enough complaints to get him suspended, but enough for a pattern. If he's getting away with this now, chances are he's gotten away with worse. Maybe it's time we start looking deeper. Elijah's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much. Daniels didn't just act out of instinct. There was a confidence in his behavior, a certainty that he could do what he did without consequence. "I'll take care of it," Elijah said. "You sure?" "Yeah, I have a feeling this goes beyond just one traffic stop." After the call ended, Elijah sat back in his seat, his mind working through the possibilities. If Daniels had a pattern, it meant there were likely others. People who didn't have the resources or the authority to fight back. And if that was the case, then this was bigger than just what had happened today. The next morning, Elijah took a drive downtown, straight to the local precinct. He had no intention of making a scene, but he wanted to see the place for himself. Walking in, he immediately noticed how the officers looked at him. Not in a friendly way, not in an openly hostile way either, but with that cautious tension that came when someone in authority showed up unannounced. The receptionist, a younger officer with tired eyes, looked up at him. "Can I help you? I'm here to see Captain Dawson." The officer hesitated but nodded. "1 second." Elijah folded his arms as he waited, taking in the room. A few officers were chatting near the coffee machine. Some glanced his way, but quickly looked back down. It was a quiet kind of tension, but it was there. A door swung open, and a tall man in a Navy uniform stepped out. His badge read *** Captain Dawson ***, and the moment he spotted Elijah, his expression hardened. "Agent Moore," Dawson said, his tone neutral but guarded. "I heard about yesterday." "Then you already know why I'm here," Elijah replied. Dawson gestured toward his office. "Let's talk." Inside, Dawson sat behind his desk, motioning for Elijah to take a seat. He didn't. Instead, he stood with his hands in his pockets. "Your officers made a bad stop. It happens," Elijah said. "But what concerns me isn't just what they did. It's the way they handled it after the fact. Daniels knew he had no reason to cuff me, and he did it anyway." Dawson leaned back in his chair. "Daniels is a good officer." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "He's been on the force for years. Experienced, reliable. He doesn't." "Doesn't what?" "Make mistakes." "Overstep his authority?" Elijah cut in. Because from where I was standing, he had no problem doing either of those things. Dawson exhaled sharply, looking at Elijah with something between frustration and caution. "Look, I get it. What happened shouldn't have happened. But you know how this works. Internal affairs isn't going to step in over a traffic stop that ended without violence. Daniels didn't use force. He didn't escalate beyond." "He didn't have to," Elijah interrupted. "The issue isn't just about what he did. It's about what he's done before, and what he's going to keep doing if no one stops him." Dawson's jaw tightened. "What are you implying?" Elijah studied him. "I think you already know." There was a beat of silence between them. Then finally, Dawson exhaled. "If there's a real problem, I need more than just your word." Elijah smirked. "That's exactly what I came here to get." He turned and walked out without another word, feeling Dawson's eyes on his back the entire way. He didn't expect the captain to admit anything outright, but he had seen something in Dawson's reaction: hesitation, discomfort. It was subtle, but it was there. As Elijah stepped out of the building, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. ***, you're asking the wrong questions. ***. Elijah stared at the screen, his pulse picking up. He quickly scanned the area, but there was no one nearby who seemed out of place. His instincts were screaming at him now. This was bigger than just Daniels. He had only scratched the surface, and someone didn't want him digging any deeper. Elijah's grip tightened around his phone as he stared at the message. His instincts told him this wasn't just a warning. It was a challenge. Someone knew he was looking into Daniels, and they wanted him to stop. But instead of scaring him off, it only confirmed what he had suspected. This was bigger than a bad traffic stop. Bigger than one officer with a history of misconduct. Someone was trying to keep him from digging deeper, which meant he was getting close to something they didn't want uncovered. He quickly scanned his surroundings again, but the street outside the precinct looked normal. No one lingering too long. No suspicious cars idling at the curb. Yet the unease in his gut remained. Whoever sent the message wasn't far. They were watching. Elijah took a breath and slid his phone back into his pocket. If they thought a vague text would be enough to make him walk away, they didn't know him at all. He had been in the FBI long enough to recognize when a threat was more than just a bluff. That night, he sat at his desk with his laptop open, sifting through reports. Daniels had a record, not one that would get him fired, but enough small complaints to suggest a pattern. Unlawful stops. Excessive force allegations that never stuck. Minor disciplinary actions that never turned into anything serious. It was clear he had been protected. And if Daniels was protected, then someone above him was making sure he stayed on the force. Elijah leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. He needed more than just reports. He needed proof. Something undeniable. If Daniels was as reckless as he seemed, there was a good chance there were victims out there with stories to tell. People who had been harassed, intimidated, or worse, but never had the power to fight back. A few hours later, Elijah parked outside a small, dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town. The place was quiet, the kind of spot where people kept to themselves. Inside, a man sat alone at a booth near the back, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. His posture was stiff, his expression wary. Elijah slid into the seat across from him. "Appreciate you meeting me." The man, a local mechanic named Marcus Hill, nodded but didn't meet Elijah's eyes. "Not sure how much help I can be." Elijah studied him. "I think you know exactly how much help you can be." Marcus let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around his cup. "I got a family, man. I can't afford to get mixed up in this." "You're already mixed up in it," Elijah said. "I read the report. 3 years ago, Daniels pulled you over, accused you of stealing your own car. Had you in cuffs for an hour before letting you go without a charge. That wasn't the only time, was it?" Marcus shook his head slightly. "He came after me again last year. Said I was lingering outside my own shop. Kept his hand on his gun the whole time like he was waiting for an excuse." He finally looked up, his eyes dark with something between anger and fear. "Guys like him, they don't stop until they feel like they own you." Elijah nodded slowly. "You ever reported?" Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "And say what?" "That a cop in this town keeps messing with me. Even if someone listened, you think they'd actually do something about it." Elijah leaned forward. "What if I told you this wasn't just about Daniels? What if I told you there's a reason he's still on the force, even after everything he's done?" Marcus hesitated. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Daniels isn't acting alone. Someone's protecting him. And if they're willing to cover for him, that means they've got something bigger to lose." Elijah paused. "But the only way we get to the truth is if people like you are willing to talk." Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then he exhaled sharply and pulled out his phone. "You said proof, right?" He tapped the screen a few times before turning it toward Elijah. A grainy video played, a recording from inside Marcus's shop. Daniel stood in the frame, his stance aggressive. His hand rested on his belt, just inches from his gun. His voice, though muffled, was clear enough. "Asterisk, asterisk, you don't want trouble, do you?" then maybe you keep your mouth shut next time. Asterisk asterisk. Elijah's blood ran cold. This wasn't just harassment. This was a threat. He looked up at Marcus. You held on to this for a reason. Marcus swallowed hard. I didn't know what to do with it. Figured if I ever needed it, I'd have it. But I also figured if I used it, I'd be putting a target on my back. You won't be alone in this, Elijah said, but we need to move fast. If Daniels is this bold, then whatever he's covering up is serious. Marcus hesitated again, then nodded. I just want this to stop. Elijah took the phone and copied the video. He had what he needed. But as he stepped out of the diner, that feeling from earlier returned, the one that told him he was being watched. He barely had time to react before headlights flared in the distance. A black SUV was parked at the far end of the lot, engine running. It hadn't been there when he arrived. Elijah's pulse picked up. He started toward his car, but before he could reach it, the SUV's tires screeched, and it lurched forward, speeding straight toward him. Elijah barely had time to react. The SUV's headlights bore down on him, the engine roaring as it closed the distance in seconds. He dove to the side, hitting the pavement hard as the vehicle swerved past him. Tires screeched as it turned sharply, speeding off into the night without stopping. A clear message, this wasn't just intimidation. It was a warning. Heart pounding, Elijah scrambled to his feet, scanning the street, but the SUV had disappeared. By morning, Ramirez had sent him a file. What he found inside sent a chill down his spine. Daniels wasn't just being protected, he was part of something much bigger. The officer's disciplinary records barely scratched the surface. There were payments made to him from a private security firm with ties to city officials. Connections to a former police chief who had quietly stepped down years ago amid corruption rumors. And worst of all, Daniels was not working alone. Elijah's gut told him there was a deeper operation at play, one that stretched beyond just harassment and intimidation. The pattern of stops, the way certain people were targeted, it was all deliberate. Someone was pulling strings, and Daniels was just a pawn in a much larger game. As Elijah sat in his office, reviewing the files, an alert popped up on his screen. A new email. No subject. No sender. Just a single line of text. Asterisk asterisk, you were warned. Walk away asterisk asterisk. Attached was a grainy image. It was him, standing outside the diner last night. Someone had been watching. His blood ran cold. They weren't just trying to scare him. They were tracking his every move. And if they knew where he had been, it meant they knew about Marcus too. Elijah grabbed his keys and headed straight for Marcus's shop. When he arrived, the place was eerily quiet. Too quiet. The usual hum of tools and conversation was absent. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The shop was a mess. Papers scattered, toolboxes overturned. A sign of a struggle. Marcus? Elijah called out. No response. His pulse quickened as he moved further inside. Then he saw it. A phone on the ground, screen cracked. Marcus's phone. Elijah's mind raced. This was no longer just about corruption. This was about control. Someone wanted to silence Marcus before he could talk. But they had made a mistake. Because now, Elijah wasn't just investigating a dirty cop. He was hunting whoever was pulling the strings. And he wouldn't stop until he found them. Elijah's heart pounded as he scanned the ransacked shop. The air was thick with oil and metal, but something else lingered, an unease. A tension that told him he was already running out of time. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to think clearly. If Marcus had been taken, there had to be a reason. Someone didn't just want to scare him. They wanted him silenced. He crouched down, picking up Marcus's cracked phone. The screen flickered weakly before going black. Elijah slipped it into his pocket and took a slow breath. He needed to move fast, but recklessly rushing in wouldn't help anyone. He pulled out his own phone and dialed Ramirez. "They took him," he said as soon as she answered. A heavy silence. Then Ramirez spoke, her voice sharper than before. "We figured this might happen. I ran more checks on Daniels and his ties to that security firm. It's bad, Elijah. The company isn't just working with dirty cops. It's running a full-scale operation, using officers like Daniels to target people they see as threats. Marcus must have been on their list." Elijah's fingers tightened around his phone. "Do we have a location?" There was a pause, then Ramirez exhaled. "We do. A warehouse near the docks. Surveillance picked up movement there last night, and guess who was seen entering?" "Daniels," Elijah muttered. "And 2 other officers," Ramirez confirmed. "You can't go in alone. I'm sending backup." But Elijah was already moving, slipping back into his car and peeling onto the road. Backup wouldn't get there fast enough. He didn't need an army. He needed to act before Marcus became another name in a case file. The drive felt endless, every second stretching too long. The docks were nearly deserted at this hour, the few scattered streetlights casting weak yellow glows over rows of empty shipping containers. Elijah parked a few blocks away and made his way in on foot, his breath steady, his mind focused. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and silent. Too silent. He moved cautiously, pressing himself against the wall near a side entrance. The faint sound of voices carried from inside. He strained to listen. Should have just kept his mouth shut. A third voice scoffed. "Yeah, well, maybe he should hurry up. We don't need more eyes on us." Elijah inhaled, steadying himself. The door was locked, but the rusted handle was weak. He pressed against it just enough to hear the faint click of metal shifting. The door creaked open an inch. Inside, he caught a glimpse of Marcus, tied to a chair, a cut above his brow, but alive. 3 officers stood around him, their guns holstered but within easy reach. Elijah moved quickly. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his own weapon raised. "Hands where I can see them." The room erupted into chaos. Daniel spun, his hand flying toward his holster. But Elijah was faster. "Don't," he warned, his voice cold. "Put your hands up." The other 2 officers hesitated, eyes darting between Elijah and each other. But Daniel sneered, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake, Agent." Elijah's grip didn't waver. "You kidnapped an innocent man. You've been running an illegal operation. You want to talk about mistakes." Daniels took a slow step forward. "You don't get it, do you? This is bigger than me. Bigger than you. You think you're here shutting down some corrupt cop. You're walking into something you can't control." Elijah's jaw tightened. He knew Daniels was stalling, buying time for something or someone. Then the sound of a car pulling up outside. More reinforcements. Elijah couldn't wait to find out. He moved swiftly, closing the distance between him and Daniels. With one quick motion, he knocked the gun from Daniels's holster and shoved him against the wall. The other 2 officers froze, unsure of their next move. "Here's what's going to happen," Elijah said, his voice dangerously low. "You're going to step away from Marcus. You're going to drop your weapons, and then you're going to explain exactly who you've been working for." Daniels laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "You really think this ends here?" A second later, the warehouse doors burst open. Elijah turned, bracing for another fight. But instead, a wave of FBI agents flooded in, weapons drawn. Ramirez stepped forward, her eyes sharp as they locked onto Daniels. "You've got nowhere left to run," she said. Daniels glared at her, but didn't resist as another agent moved in to cuff him. His two accomplices followed, hands raised in surrender. Elijah let out a slow breath before turning to Marcus, quickly untying him. "You okay?" Marcus let out a weak chuckle, rubbing his wrists. "I've had better nights." As the FBI secured the scene, Ramirez stepped beside Elijah. "This operation ran deeper than we thought, but we got them." She hesitated. "Well, most of them." Elijah frowned. "What do you mean?" Ramirez handed him a file. "The real mastermind behind all this. He's still out there." Elijah flipped it open, his stomach twisting at the sight of the name at the top. Someone he never expected. Someone who had been playing both sides all along. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Elijah stared at the name in the file, his mind racing. He had suspected corruption ran deep, but this was worse than he imagined. The person behind it all wasn't just another crooked cop or a low-level criminal. It was someone high up, someone with enough power to make things disappear before they even became a problem. Ramirez watched him carefully. "We need to move fast," she said. "If he gets wind that we're onto him, he'll vanish." Elijah nodded, his grip tightening around the folder. "We can't let that happen." They left the warehouse as more agents secured the scene, ensuring that Daniels and his men were properly processed. Outside, Marcus was sitting on the back of an ambulance, getting checked over by a paramedic. His face was bruised, and he looked exhausted, but there was a glint in his eye, a mix of relief and determination. "You good?" Elijah asked as he approached. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. "I should be asking you that. You just took down an entire operation." He glanced toward the agents loading Daniels into a car. "But I'm guessing this isn't over yet." Elijah handed him the folder, and Marcus flipped it open. His expression darkened as he read the name. "You have got to be kidding me." "Nope," Elijah said. "He's been pulling strings from the inside, covering up dirty operations like this for years." Elijah clenched his jaw. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance." They didn't have long. Every second counted. The next few hours were a blur of movement. Agents spread out across the city, tracking bank transactions, phone records, and known associates. The target, Deputy Commissioner Russell Harrington, was a man who had spent years operating in the shadows, always careful, always just out of reach. He had built his career on a reputation of being tough on crime, but behind closed doors, he was making sure certain crimes were never solved. Elijah and Ramirez stayed on the move, following leads as they came in. They knew they had one chance to get this right. If they hesitated, Harrington would be gone. Then finally, a break. A car registered under a shell company linked to Harrington was spotted heading toward a private airstrip on the outskirts of town. "He's running," Marcus muttered. "Not if we get there first," Elijah said. They drove fast, cutting through traffic as they raced toward the airstrip. By the time they arrived, the sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the tarmac. There, just ahead, was Harrington. He stood beside a sleek private jet, speaking to a pilot. Even from a distance, he looked calm, as if this was just another business trip. Elijah and Marcus moved quickly, Ramirez and her team flanking from the side. The moment Harrington spotted them, his face changed. He turned, making a break for the jet. "Freeze," Ramirez shouted. Harrington ignored her, rushing up the stairs. But before he could disappear inside, Elijah was on him. He grabbed Harrington by the arm and pulled him back, slamming him against the railing. "You're done," Elijah said through gritted teeth. Harrington's expression flickered, just for a second. Then he forced a smirk. "You think this changes anything?" he said. "You think arresting me stops the system?" Elijah narrowed his eyes. "No, but it's a start." Ramirez stepped forward, cuffs in hand. "Russell Harrington, you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding and abetting criminal activity." Harrington let out a dry laugh as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. "There will always be another me," he said. "You'll never clean up all of it." Elijah looked him in the eye. "Maybe not," he said. "But one by one, we'll take you all down." With Harrington in custody, the weight of the case finally settled. It wasn't just about one corrupt officer or a small group abusing their power. It was about a system that had allowed it to happen for so long. This was just the beginning. As they left the airstrip, Marcus walked alongside Elijah, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said. "A man like him actually paying for what he's done." Elijah exhaled. "There's still a long way to go. But yeah, today we won." They watched as the sun fully rose, washing the city in light. A new day, a new fight ahead. But for now, they had done what they came to do. And that was enough.